now entering the horror sanctum.
Hello and welcome back to the Horror Sanctum. I'm Jay, joined by John, Kellen, and TJ, and 2023 is in full effect. It's really hard to believe. With our second episode of the year, the Magic McDonald's Bucket gave us the 2006 horror comedy Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon. This may be a film you aren't familiar with, but you definitely should be. Think Halloween meets The Office. And as usual, there will be spoilers involved, so hopefully you knew this was coming up. You watched the movie with us, so you're just, along for the ride. So it's directed by Scott Glosserman. Behind the Mask is about nice, normal-looking Leslie Vernon, who has an obsession with movie-style slashers like Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, and Freddy Krueger. Leslie decides to follow in the footsteps of his heroes, and ever the self-promoter that he is, invites a documentary filmmaker and her crew to follow him around as he constructs his own grisly legacy. Halloween meets The Office. I was looking for a reason to rewatch this movie again anyways, because I loved it. I guess this is probably my fifth time watching it, so I'm excited to dive back in. This pick was John's, so we're going to let him take the wheel today.
So yeah, this movie's interesting. For me, this started probably around 2009. I was in college. Rented this from Hollywood Video, rest in peace. And it was kind of like a rotation for me. It was this, it was Hatchet, it was like Jack Brooks' Monster Slayer. It was like these revolving movies I'd watch like before going to class. I don't know why. I would just stay up all night and watch these random direct-to-video horror movies. But yeah, I mean, I've loved this movie ever since it came out. It's funny, the Leslie Vernon character, the lead guy in this movie, he's not really like a Jason or a Michael. He's more like, it's kind of like if you took like Dane Cook and then you mix Ryan Reynolds and, like you were saying, The Office, like a little bit of Michael Scott. It's like he's this smart ass character, but I really think that works in this film because it really lets the audience like drop their guard and the characters he's interacting with, the news crew. How this started was basically there was a screenwriter, David Steve. He was pretty much like a struggling screenwriter in Hollywood. He was trying to figure out what he was going to do. So he's sitting there one night, he's watching Halloween, and he's thinking, like, I wonder if Michael Myers ever doubted his motivations. I wonder if he ever just thought, like, should I be killing people? So that's kind of how this movie came to be, how it sort of evolved, and then eventually they went into production, and that's how Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon happened. It was always kind of meant to be like a mockumentary style comedy. That was kind of always the nature of the film, like a little tongue-in-cheek. But I think they didn't, especially in the making of, from what I was watching and reading, they were saying they never wanted to go too far one side or the other. They always wanted it to be kind of that nice balance. I even think they said in the making of, they mentioned that they did not want to have a scene where, like Freddy and Jason and Leatherface are playing cards at a table playing poker and shit. They didn't want it to be that ridiculous, but they wanted it to be a little bit fun where, like they acknowledge Elm Street is real. They acknowledge, Haddonfield and Halloween is real. They acknowledge that Crystal Lake is real. So there's a lot of those little things like that where it's Easter eggs, but it's also kind of playing a little bit of fun with the genre. This film was pretty much, I think, shot all around the Pacific Northwest, I think in Oregon. It came out, Anchor Bay distributed it at the time. It was a limited theatrical release. Didn't do very well, unfortunately. I think the box office was like, it was really bad. I think it was like 75,000. It was really low. So it was really just a cult movie, right? It came out, Anchor Bay put it out, and it kind of had a shelf life on DVD. and that's kind of where the popularity came from. I think the thing about this movie that works so much though is the Leslie character. I think just because he's so charming, he's so smooth, he's such an easy like smooth talker. He's very funny, and he really the news crew that's covering him in the movie and the audience as you're watching, you let your guard down in front of this guy. You think, oh, he's a nice guy. But what's so great about it is that he's not lying. There's nothing he does in the movie that's a lie. He's completely honest from the get-go. He's like, I'm a psycho. I'm doing this. This is what I'm going to do. And you just think, oh, well, he's just saying this. But what you realize is he's just setting up this entire scenario to sort of like let your guard down and manipulate you, especially with the news crew. He's using them as a part of spoilers. He's using them kind of as a part of his plot in the third act, right? So I just think that was like an interesting way to do it. The movie, they could have easily made Leslie like a hulking, brooding, kind of like obvious psycho, but I think making him the nice guy, the charmer, like that Ted Bundy type is, I thought that was pretty smart. What do you think about the movie, Jay?
Like I said, it's probably my fifth time watching it, and it's 100% cult classic. Like, it's a movie you see, and even the cover kind of looks like I don't think I should watch that. It looks awful, but it's very deceiving because it flows so well, and it is very well balanced between the comedy and horror is a strong word for it, obviously, but the plot line is it's a horror movie. He's setting up this scenario where he's going to kill the film crew, but they don't know, and it's just so brilliant, and nothing that I can think of offhand has really compared to that in what they did. There's tons of horror comedies, but nothing like that where you do feel like you're watching an episode of The Office, and you feel that the Scrantones music come in, and it's him in his mask and his overalls. So that was something I really appreciate about it, especially when I watched it the first time, because when I watched it the first time, I had zero expectations, and it completely exceeded anything I could have imagined. I still think it's a movie a lot of people haven't seen, which is sad. But maybe after this and our millions of listeners, we'll get them some more money in their pocket. But biggest takeaways for me were cameos, or even Easter eggs, if you want to call them. The late great Scott Wilson plays his best friend, like almost like a mentor. If you know him, he's Herschel from The Walking Dead. R.I.P. in The Walking Dead, R.I.P. in real life. Zelda Rubinstein from Poltergeist is the librarian. I mean, unmistakable. Robert Englund as the Loomis character was great. Even Kane Hodder for 2 seconds we see him in the beginning as he's trimming bushes. Like, just little things like that made me appreciate it more, because that's like you go to a nice restaurant, you get a steak and mashed potatoes, that's great, but the garnish, and they put special little details into the dish, that's what puts it over the top. For me, that's what this movie did. It put it over the top by that. Also, we always talk about the kills, but like, you don't see a lot of them. Like, so he goes into a room and there's a struggle, then he comes out, which leaves more to your imagination, which I appreciate that too.
And it saves money on special effects too.
Yeah,
less is more.
And I'm sure they didn't have a ton of money. They may have broken even with what they made, but overall, great film for me. Top tier horror comedies, I think. But I give it that title also because I know it's underappreciated and it shouldn't be. Mm-hmm. But I enjoyed it thoroughly. And if you followed our text chain, someone had some words for it, Mr. Lee. And like, whose pick was this? It was like John, and then he makes the frowny face. So let's toss the ball over to Kellen to see what he really thought.
Plot twist, I loved it.
Bamboozled.
I was just being a jerk. No, this movie had no business being as good as it was. They had literally, other than the writing, they had nothing going for them. They didn't have a budget. They didn't have big names. They didn't have, like you said, a large release date. They had nothing that would warrant a good movie. Even like Jay mentioned, the box art just looks like, a sci-fi channel, thrown together movie for a Friday night. Nothing about this movie said this is going to be a good film.
Mm.
It's fantastic. It's so good. And I don't think it's really been hit on, but name another movie where they get away with telling you everything that's gonna happen and you still enjoy seeing it unfold. Because that's what this movie is. It's basically like a documentary about Michael Myers or about, Jason Voorhees. The behind the scene part, you watch Halloween and it's the build up to the night. You see her walking with her friends, driving back from school, at school. You see all that stuff. You don't think about, you see glimpses of Michael Myers in that film, obviously watching her, but you don't think about the build up to that, especially when you consider that, most horror villains or protagonists are made to be like supernatural. You don't think of them as just humans creating, chaos. And that's what this movie does is these are real guys that have planned this. These are serial killers, basically. They're not, the whole Jason Voorhees, he died and that's how he was able to come back and kill people because they thought he was dead. That's what they built that movie on. Leslie Vernon died, and so it was the impetus for him being able to become the killer that he wanted to be. And so you go through the movie, and it's a mockumentary, but it's done like it's a documentary of one of these classic killers getting ready for his first kill. And then there's a point in the movie when it starts and then it switches from a documentary into a horror film. Just like in every other horror film, there's that moment where the fun and games have ended and the murder begins. And that's what this movie does is it goes from being a documentary about somebody who has aspirations of being a famous killer to him becoming the killer. And then it becomes that classic horror film where he pops up at random places that you wouldn't expect him to. They find the bodies in random places. Everything that he laid out starts happening, and it becomes less a documentary and more of your classic style horror movie. And it's just great. Just the way, the mask is a little goofy, but I think it fits the character because he's a little goofy. He's not like you said, he's not a big hulking dude. So he's not, you wouldn't expect him to be, this monster. You'd expect him to be, the goofy friend in a, buddy comedy, So yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed the whole movie. It doesn't even really start slow because it kind of draws you in because you want to see what's going to happen, even though they're telling you what's going to happen. And even the twist in the movie, that's going to be the twist. They've built up to all this. But even when it's revealed, the big, reveal of who actually is who, you kind of knew that was going to happen anyway. But it doesn't take away from the enjoyment of watching it and to see, your heroine, your final girl, go through all of the steps that he said she would go through to become who she was meant to be by his actions. So even though they try to mislead you, that that's not what's going to happen. What's actually going to happen. So I thought whoever came up with this idea, it's a brilliant idea. The way it was shot, considering, like you said, they probably had no budget. They did the best they possibly could with what they had. So yeah, great movie. Fantastic. Good job, John.
Thank you. So what did you think, TJ?
Well, I was actually excited to watch this again because this was only like the second or third at the most times that I'd seen it, and I remember really enjoying it and being surprised by it. But I remember because I was big into the DVD collecting scene when this movie come out, and I remember when a lot of the reviews for the DVD first come out, it was kind of like a 50-50 love it or hate it kind of thing. And I remember the dividing point, whether you could take the journey that this film was inviting you to take or not, was if you could accept that it's being shot like a documentary, but also that it's in a alternate version of reality where, you know, Freddy Krueger, Jason, and Michael Myers are real. And a lot of people at that point in time, I mean, you have to understand that most people hadn't discovered the British office yet. This was 2006. I think the original, the U.S. office either come out that year or the year before the first season. And it was kind of like, it was 2005. I thought so. And
it's
it
definitely
was
kind of ahead of its time.
Yeah, it's ahead of its time. I feel like this movie would have found an audience, a bigger audience sooner if it had come out maybe 4 or 5 years later, when that kind of comedy was becoming more mainstream in the US. And definitely mixing it in the form of a horror film, because it's not sold that way. Nothing in the marketing tells you that it's going to be that. I mean, if you pick up the box, maybe the box says something about it being a documentary or something. But at that point in time, when you thought documentary and horror, you thought Blair Witch, and this is not the Blair Witch. Mm-hmm. So I think people just didn't know how to take it when it first come out. But I'm really glad it's become a cult film. I think it's got like a solid 6.7 on IMDb right now, which is, for a horror film of that ilk, that's not like an all-time classic. That's pretty good. I mean, anything over, you know, a 6 or more is like pretty good horror film. I remember watching it this time because I just watched it in the past week. I couldn't help but think, man, this guy really reminds me of like a B grade Jim Carrey. Just all through it, I just kept thinking, this is like,
I could see that.
Yeah, this is like knockoff Jim Carrey guy. But now I can definitely see the Dane Cook thing. I must have missed the Kane Hodder thing. I must have blinked and missed the Kane Hodder cameo.
I had to go back because Kellen asked about it, and I said, I think he was in the beginning. So after I finished watching it again, I went back and he's trimming the bushes.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Inside the house.
Okay. Yeah, because the other ones are more obvious. Being the former English teacher that I am, I appreciated the classic literature allusion to finding one's Ahab, referencing Captain Ahab from the Herman Melville classic Moby Dick, where he's got to find his white whale, by God. And I guess Leslie Vernon's the white whale. I've never liked The Mask. I can tolerate it more now. I've lived with it for like over 15 years at this point. And I mean, because it's kind of this mixed bag. It's like, after you say, okay, well, all of these really famous, iconic masks are the mask of killers that already exist. You can't really rip off any of those things. And then what's left, you know?
Right.
It's kind of like a losing battle there. So I think it fits the character, like Kellen said. And because it's like, okay, I'm supposed to be this like hillbilly zombie man that's also a psycho killer, which totally doesn't fit the persona of who he's presenting as in this documentary, which makes it all the more creepier, because I love it. I love it. It's just like I think Kellen said before, it's like he shows you exactly what he's going to do, which is brilliant on two ways, because in all those scenes, it actually shows the kill scenes. Like, theoretically, this is how it's going to happen. And then it uses that same footage when it actually happens, so they don't have to film it twice. So it served a dual purpose for a low budget film. But also it's like, oh, you don't have to refilm it, but it's also makes his plan that much more brilliant, because it's like, oh, no, yes, even though you thought you flipped the script and are doing things differently, it's still happening exactly the way he planned it, which just lets you know that there's a bigger piece of the puzzle going on, a bigger map than what you see. And even to the very end, when the girl who's the interviewer, you find out that she's the actual virgin. Of course, obviously the audience knows this about 15 minutes before she realizes it. I guess that's the only plot thing I see could have been made a little tighter. But I mean, working with what you got, a lot of these actors were still pretty young in their careers and stuff, and I give that a pass. But yeah, I like the movie. I recently rebought it at McKay's somewhat recently, and I haven't seen it in years. So it was in my queue to rewatch anyway. But yeah, I think this film, and I love horror comedy. I think that is an underutilized genre, and it's one that when people have kind of come to it and tried to do it, a lot of them are really terrible. It's hard to do well. I think horror and comedy are the two things that are the hardest to do well, and when you try and marry them together,
Yeah.
it's masterful when anything works, really. So, and then to have had this kind of humor that was kind of ahead of the curve in it, I just think it's an outlier. I can't think of another film. Certainly, there's other documentary horrors. There's Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. There's Blair Witch. There's the whole found footage genre.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's some that do it comedically. Even recently, what was the Dead one on Shudder that did it pretty effectively?
Was it Deadspin?
Yeah,
Deadspin. Yeah,
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That was good, But this thing did it 16 years ago, and it works. I think that's the best thing I can say for it. Is it attempts a big swing, and as long as you're willing to go with the premise of, okay, this is a mockumentary and it's in a fictionalized world where these other iconic horror people exist, then you can go for the ride. Oh, one thing in terms of trivia, things that I was looking into, is it Scott Wilson? Is that the Herschel character?
Eugene, yeah.
Yeah. So he apparently was initially supposed to be Billy from Black Christmas, the killer from Black Christmas. Kellen might not know what that is. I don't know.
Not a clue.
Okay. So
real quick before I forget, my brain is everywhere all the time. But you said something that made me think of this, and I didn't think of it until this exact moment. But we can all agree on what the best kill in the whole movie was, because there's not a whole lot shown, but there's one very specific kill that is epic with the post hole diggers.
Oh, sure. Yeah,
that was my favorite kill.
Yeah.
And it made me think that was a nod to all those horror films. Every one of those have one specific kill. I mean, there may be others that you like, but there's one that's so iconic. Michael Myers nailing the guy to the door.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody remembers that. Freddy Krueger pulling Johnny Depp through the bed at the end of Nightmare on Elm Street. Jason Voorhees killing Kevin Bacon. Like those iconic, that kill that you immediately associate with that killer. And they gave one to Leslie Vernon. Because all of them were pretty mild considering, but then there's the post hole scene where he literally pulls the guy's heart out of his chest and sits it in his hand. And I was like, that's fantastic. If you had to spend your budget on one kill, they nailed it with that, because that was phenomenal.
Did anyone have a different kill that they enjoyed aside from that one?
No, that was it. But I do like it for a whole nother reason, because it spiritually has some tissue that connects to our previous film, Theater of Blood, where you're extracting a pound of flesh.
Literally.
They do it better in this movie, obviously. But I appreciate, anytime you take a person's heart out, I can't help but think of Scorpion and Mortal Kombat and love that.
So
yeah,
there was a sequel to the movie. You guys see all that?
Yes.
Comics. So I think it was 6 issues.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, no idea.
The Return Before the Mask, The Return of Leslie Vernon. It's a 6-part comic book series.
Yep.
It's not cheap.
Does anybody know how that ends up? Because obviously in the credits, it's
a prequel.
Alive.
It's a prequel.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
The credits were great because they played Talking Head Psycho Killer.
Yes.
So well, sitting there watching the whole time. That's another part, even at the end credits. We know exactly what's going to happen, but we're still sitting there like,
I didn't turn it off until
like, how's it going to happen?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The old Michael Myers.
Which they had to apparently film that a whole crap ton of times because it had to be specifically timed to the exact way that they were spanning their credits, their credit roll.
And that was another thing too, is he talked about putting the stuff in that cream he was putting on him that was fire retardant because almost predicted that was going to happen. He said somebody is going to get crushed in that apple masher. So it makes you think that obviously he didn't make it to where it would fully crush his head, because he put that idea in her head. So like you said, you get to the credits, and even though the whole barn goes up in flames, in the back of your mind, you're thinking he knew those two things were going to happen. He planned for those two things. So you're watching the credits waiting for him to sit up.
Yeah. And he sabotaged all the weapons too. So why wouldn't he have sabotaged that?
Yeah. I think there's only 2 times in the movie you actually see Leslie, really. The part where he's getting crushed in the apple thing by Angela, and he's like sitting there and he's like screaming and dying, and he goes, I think he says like, "I knew you were the one," that time. And when she is confronting him, or he's confronting her outside of the restaurant, the diner, and he's like, "What did I tell you about talking to this? It's off limits." And she says, "Have you ever been to Reno?" And he grabs her by the throat. Those are 2 points in the movie where you can tell like that's really him. Like he's no longer putting on the Michael Scott funny facade. And one thing also that I did notice too, about, you were talking about Eugene, Scott Wilson. I found this creepy ever since I've seen this movie, is when he's they're kind of sitting there eating dinner with him and they're cooking. And there's that scene where he's cutting the carrots and he just starts like basically just, pardon my French, fucking eviscerating the carrots like 90 miles an hour. That was like, that scene just like, it's like a jolt. It's like you're in this mockumentary and then it's like, oh shit, no, this guy's dangerous. Like immediately a shit.
Yeah.
But well, he buried himself alive for 3 or 4 days. So he's not all there.
Definitely, yeah.
Any final thoughts on Behind the Mask before we give our ratings?
The only thing I would say is just there's so many interesting Easter eggs in this movie. I mean, it's like you can honestly do a whole podcast just on Easter eggs for this. So one thing that I did find interesting was when he was, and I never noticed this until now, when he's sitting there prepping for the night, getting ready for basically like the whole kill night and killing the kids in the house, and he's talking to Taylor. He's sitting there putting his makeup on, and it's playing Midnight, the Stars and You, which is the same song that was in The Shining when Jack was at the bar and all. So I thought that was kind of an interesting little homage to The Shining. And I read somewhere, and I didn't notice this, maybe you guys did, but apparently when Taylor's first interviewing Eugene, and they're all sitting there in their living room, a lament configuration box can be seen on the table.
Yeah, I saw that.
I didn't notice that. So, kind of interesting. But I mean, I think the movie, it does work overall. I think the third act is a bit silly and played out, but I think that's kind of the whole point of it, in my opinion.
Right.
I don't know. I really love it though. I think for what it is, it's just like an amazing film, and it's an amazing mockumentary. I think the meta thing in 2006, the way they did it, I think is a fresh set of eyes now. It may not have the appeal in 2023 because people are just so burnt on that, like meta and that whole concept of what that is. I think at that time it was fresher. Now I think young kids unfortunately may watch this and they may just kind of be like, yeah, we already know all this, right? But
100% is part of it too, though. Like I just watched the entire series of Seinfeld start to finish for the first time ever.
Wow.
And guess what? I absolutely loved it. But if
my favorite show ever
started, I would not have liked it. A younger Jay would not have liked Seinfeld. I'd be like, I don't get it. Now I get it. Same thing with this film. Is if we were young and we watched it, we're like, okay, it's kind of weird, but it grows on you and you learn to appreciate it because you evolve yourself. Same thing like a kid, like one of Lindsay's nieces could watch this movie and they're not going to watch it. They're going to absolutely hate it. That's because they don't understand it. 10 more years down the road, they might like it a little bit more. But that's just shows again it was ahead of its time.
That's true.
But I think overall I gave it 4 Leslie Vernons out of 5. 4.5, but I'll stick with 4. It's a lot of fun, and everybody should watch it. Honestly, John, would you give it?
Definitely 4 out of 5. I'm right there with you. I shave a point off just because I think the comedy sometimes is a bit heavy-handed, but yeah, 4 out of 5, solid.
Kellen?
Yeah, I'm right there with y'all. 4. And I think I could almost lean to 4.5, but I'm going to stick with 4, just because for what this movie is, for what they had to work with, there are movies with 100 times this budget, horror films that just you could rip apart for everything they screw up. And even if you look at this and you try to nitpick, when you take into consideration what they were working with, I mean, they crushed it. They knocked it out of the park with what little they had. So, I mean, solid 4. Like,
Teach?
Yeah, I think if you just cold asked me without really thinking about, what they did with what little they had, without that, just the film on itself, I would probably give more like a 3.5 out of 5. But when you take into account what they did on their budget and pulled it off, I have to respect that. And I give them a bump to a 4 for that, because it is impressive.
4. Don't give in to peer pressure, TJ. Give it a 3.5 if you want.
No, I'd say 4. 4 is fair.
4. There you have it, ladies.
Wow.
4.5 for the Behind the Mask Rise of Leslie Vernon. Now, before we wrap up this episode, we're going to have to pick our next film. So the McDonald's bucket is here. You hear all those juicy movies in there. Let's see what's next. I don't know what this is. Slashers 2001.
Oh, wow.
Back to back, John.
Nice. Yes, this is an interesting one too. It's also a documentary.
What is it called? Slasher 2001, or that's just
it's called Slashers, but it's kind of like a mockumentary, similar type of deal. Yeah.
Okay.
Something new then.
I don't know this.
All right, so Slashers will be our next film. If you can find that, it's from 2001. If you want to find that and watch along with us, and you can join our conversation. But be sure to follow us on Instagram, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and wherever you're currently listening to this podcast. Also, come be a member of the Church Horror Sanctum group on Facebook for all your horror needs. I think we're 300+ strong. We post trailers and ideas and polls and all that fun stuff. We also want to start having guests on the show as well. So if we pick a movie that you absolutely love, or you'd like to be a part of the episode, hit us up. Or hit us up anyways for a future episode. Let us know that you're interested. We might have to test your knowledge on our past episodes to make sure you are listening to us and just don't want to get famous. But thanks for tuning in. Hello to our new friends in Portugal. We have some listeners in Portugal, and I don't know which one of us are responsible, but it's not one person. They've listened to a few. So thanks for listening in Portugal. See you again in about 2 weeks. On behalf of John, Kellen, TJ, and myself, we bid you adieu. And until next time,
keep it spooky.
Later.